What if one of history's greatest minds held beliefs about women so controversial, so unsettling, that even today, most people refuse to talk about them? Aristotle, celebrated as the father of logic, science, and philosophy, left behind insights that changed the world. But hidden within his brilliance lies a darker, more disturbing view, one that reveals what he really thought about women. In this video, we uncover the terrifying truth Aristotle believed about most women, a truth no one dares to say out loud. To understand Aristotle's controversial views on women, we have to go back more than 2,000 years to ancient Greece, a civilization often praised for its advancements in philosophy, art, and politics, but one that was deeply patriarchal at its core. Women in this society were not citizens. They could not vote, own property independently, or take part in public debate. Their roles were confined almost entirely to the domestic sphere. They were expected to obey their fathers, then their husbands, and live lives largely in the shadows of men. From birth, their value was measured not by their intellect or ambition, but by their ability to bear children and manage a household. In Athens, the intellectual heart of ancient Greece, even the most progressive thinkers operated under the assumption that men were naturally superior. While a few rare women may have broken through these societal chains, the dominant narrative was clear. The public world was for men, and the private world was for women. This was the world that shaped Aristotle's thinking. He wasn't an outsider to this culture. He was its champion. A student of Plato and teacher to Alexander the Great, Aristotle inherited not only a legacy of intellectual rigor, but also the social values that defined Greek society. And though he expanded the boundaries of human knowledge in many ways, when it came to gender, he reinforced the boundaries society had already set. Aristotle approached every subject, biology, politics, ethics, with a systematic and observational lens. And it was through this lens that he formed one of his most shocking beliefs: that women are, in essence, defective males. According to Aristotle's biological theories, the male body represented the ideal form. In reproduction, he argued, the male supplies the form and the soul, while the female provides only the matter. He believed that when nature failed to produce a male child, the result was a female, a kind of biological error, an incomplete version of the intended outcome. This idea wasn't just a metaphor, it was, in his mind, a scientific reality. Aristotle observed that women were physically smaller, had less body heat, and were emotionally more impulsive. From these observations, he concluded that women were less rational and more passive by nature. They were not designed to lead, to philosophize, or to rule. They were designed to support. Even in the way he classified animals, Aristotle frequently described the female of the species as the weaker or less complete version of the male. This wasn't just a theory about women. It was a worldview rooted in hierarchy, one where everything had a natural place and function, and deviation from that order was considered a flaw. What made Aristotle's position even more powerful and dangerous was the influence his thinking would have on future generations. His writings were studied, preserved, and revered throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and even into the Enlightenment. For centuries, Aristotle's views on women were treated not just as opinion, but as truth. His authority lent legitimacy to the subjugation of women, often in subtle, intellectual ways that appeared rational rather than oppressive. When philosophers, scientists, and theologians searched for justification for the inequality between the sexes, they often found it in Aristotle. Even today, the remnants of this thinking persist. The idea that women are more emotional, less suited for leadership, or naturally inclined toward domesticity didn't appear out of thin air. It was carefully crafted and reinforced by centuries of philosophical tradition. And at the heart of that tradition sits Aristotle, a man whose legacy of logic and brilliance is shadowed by his chilling belief that half of humanity was, by nature, incomplete. Aristotle's views on politics weren't limited to laws and governance. They were rooted in a deep belief that everything in the natural world had a hierarchy. To him, there was an unchangeable order in which every being had its rightful place, and society functioned best when each person stayed within their natural role. In his famous work, Politics, Aristotle extends this philosophy to the structure of the household and the state. And at the heart of this structure was a chilling belief that some people are born to rule, and others are born to be ruled. This idea wasn't metaphorical or moral. It was, in his view, a law of nature. Aristotle argued that just as the soul rules the body and reason governs desire, so too must the rational male rule over the irrational female. In the same breath that he defends the legitimacy of slavery, claiming that some people are natural slaves who lack the capacity to govern themselves, he claims that women, while not slaves, also fall into a naturally subordinate category. He writes that the male is by nature fitter for command than the female, just as the older and fully developed is superior to the younger and immature. The implication is clear. Women are not equal partners in life or politics. They are perpetual minors, adults in form, but not in rational capacity. To Aristotle, a well-ordered society begins with a well-ordered household. And within that household, three relationships must be properly structured: the master and the slave, the husband and the wife, and the parent and the child. Each relationship involves a ruler and one who is ruled. But unlike the relationship between parent and child, which eventually ends in the child's independence, the relationship between husband and wife remains a permanent hierarchy. He insists that a woman's role is to obey, not out of cruelty, but because obedience aligns with her nature. He doesn't even entertain the idea of partnership or mutual decision-making between spouses. In his ideal polis, men deliberate, legislate, and lead. Women support, nurture, and follow. What makes this view particularly disturbing is that Aristotle didn't see himself as being unjust. He believed he was observing nature and simply describing the truth as it is. His philosophy carries an eerie sense of confidence, an unshakable belief that inequality is not only inevitable, but righteous. There's no room in his thinking for rebellion, reform, or change, because hierarchy is baked into the universe itself. To challenge it would be to go against the very fabric of existence. These ideas didn't remain locked in ancient scrolls. For centuries, Aristotle's notion of natural roles influenced the structure of Western civilization. Medieval theologians used his philosophy to justify male dominance within both the church and the household. Renaissance thinkers, who revived classical texts with zeal, accepted Aristotle's arguments as logical and self-evident. Even during the Enlightenment, when modern ideas of equality began to emerge, Aristotle's influence was still strong. His notion that reason was the highest human virtue, and that women were deficient in reason, provided a convenient excuse to exclude them from education, politics, and public life. What's more unsettling is that Aristotle wasn't a tyrant or a zealot. He was calm, reasoned, and methodical. That's what made his ideas so persuasive. He didn't command obedience with threats or fear. He made inequality sound rational, even virtuous. In doing so, he gave future generations the philosophical tools to maintain patriarchal systems while believing they were acting in accordance with reason and justice. Even now, echoes of Aristotle's political beliefs can be found in the way many institutions continue to function. The assumption that leadership roles are more naturally suited to men, that women are better caretakers or more suited for supporting roles. These are not just social stereotypes. They are ancient philosophical ideas passed down through centuries, often unchallenged because they were rooted not in hate, but in what seemed like reasoned observation. Aristotle's political thought, especially his idea that women are naturally ruled, is more than just an outdated belief. It is a haunting reminder of how philosophy, when unexamined, can be used to justify deeply harmful systems, and how a single idea, if accepted long enough, can shape the destiny of half the human race. When Aristotle turned his attention to marriage and love, his philosophy took on an even colder and more clinical tone. Unlike modern views that associate marriage with emotional intimacy, companionship, or mutual growth, Aristotle approached the institution as a practical arrangement, one rooted in maintaining social order, reproduction, and household stability. He saw the family unit not as a partnership of equals, but as a microcosm of his broader political philosophy, a hierarchy where the man rules with reason and the woman obeys through duty. Affection, passion, or romantic love played no essential role in this structure. The husband's role was not to love his wife in any deep emotional sense, but to govern her as he would his household, rationally, strategically, and decisively. Marriage, in Aristotle's worldview, was a necessity to continue the species and manage property, not a space for emotional connection. He believed that men and women were naturally different, not only in physical strength, but in mental capacity, and that these differences dictated their roles in the household. The man, as the rational thinker, was the decision-maker and ruler. The woman, as the more emotional and passive being, was the follower and supporter. In this arrangement, harmony meant that each person played their role without overstepping it. For a woman to question her husband's decisions or assert her own reasoning was seen as a disruption of nature's intended balance. Even in parenting, Aristotle assigned greater intellectual and moral authority to the father. The mother could nurture, but the father must guide and instruct. Women, he claimed, lacked the constancy of character required to raise virtuous citizens. This is key. In Aristotle's ethics, the ultimate goal of life was to cultivate virtue through reasoned action. But if women lacked the rational control to act virtuously in a consistent manner, then they were incapable of achieving the highest form of human flourishing. This wasn't just an insult, it was an ontological demotion. It meant that women, by their very nature, were less capable of becoming truly human in the fullest philosophical sense. The implications of this worldview were massive. If women could not reach the same heights of virtue as men, then they could not participate in politics, philosophy, or public life. Their very design, biological and psychological, was thought to render them unfit for leadership or wisdom. Love, then, was not something a man might offer his wife as an equal, but something perhaps extended to children, friends, or other men, those capable of rational exchange. The emotional and romantic dimensions of marriage, which today are seen as central, were minimized in Aristotle's theory because they were rooted in aspects of human nature he distrusted. Emotions, desires, passions, all things he believed had to be ruled, not indulged. Furthermore, this system of domination wasn't seen as abusive or unjust in Aristotle's mind. On the contrary, he saw it as a form of moral responsibility. A man who ruled his household with logic and discipline was not being oppressive. He was fulfilling his natural role. And a woman who submitted and obeyed was not being degraded. She was aligning with her true function in the order of the cosmos. This is what makes Aristotle's philosophy so chilling. It wraps control in the language of virtue. It transforms inequality into harmony and calls obedience a form of wisdom. Centuries later, these views would be echoed in religious, legal, and philosophical texts across Europe and the Islamic world. The idea of a rational man leading an emotional woman became a cultural archetype, one that persisted long after the science behind it was discredited. Even when the world began to change and women demanded education, suffrage, and freedom, Aristotle's ghost lingered in the background. His calm, logical voice, whispering that perhaps these demands went against nature itself. As we move into modernity, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable question. Was Aristotle simply a man of his time, trapped in the biases of his culture? Or was he revealing something far more difficult to face? Was he wrong? Or was he brutally honest about what he observed? This brings us to the most disturbing part of all: the possibility that Aristotle didn't invent these views about women. He merely articulated what many already believed, but lacked the courage or clarity to say. His theories were embraced not because they were shocking, but because they confirmed the existing worldview. His authority gave intellectual weight to the biases of society, transforming prejudice into natural law. In our current age, we pride ourselves on progress, on the idea that we've moved beyond such archaic and sexist beliefs. And yet, many of the attitudes that Aristotle promoted still echo in our culture. Women are still underrepresented in leadership roles, still judged more harshly for expressing emotion, still expected to support rather than lead in many contexts. The belief that women are less rational, more impulsive, or biologically unsuited for certain roles may no longer be spoken aloud, but it lives on in silence, in unconscious biases, in systemic inequalities. So perhaps the most terrifying truth is not what Aristotle thought about women. The truly frightening thing is how much of what he said continues to shape our world, not because it is true, but because for too long too many believed it was, and still do.